Good afternoon. Are we awake yet? Okay. Father Ron Robertson, as you heard, has developed kind of a bad case of bronchitis, and so he is not going to be here to perform his generally and usually sterling fulfillment of the task of moderator. I'm a little rusty. He's sterling, and so it's too bad that he's not going to be here. But at least I'll be stepping up today to read what he prepared. Introducing our next speaker, Michael Haldas is an author, a religious educator, and a speaker. He wrote the book Sacramental Living, Understanding Christianity as a Way of Life, which he presented in special leather-bound editions as gifts to both Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in private audiences at the Vatican and at the Patriarchate. Michael also does twice monthly podcasts for Ancient Faith Radio, a division of Ancient Faith Publishing. He is published monthly in Theosis magazine and is a regular contributor to a new blog series based on his book Sacramental Living. Additionally, he has recorded and contributed to multiple DVD and CD educational projects. He also serves on the board of the Washington Theological Consortium. He teaches adult religious education and high school Sunday school at the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland, and has worked with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese Religious Education Department to create educational lessons and materials. Michael has a BA in English with a concentration in business and technical writing from the University of Delaware. So please welcome Mr. Michael Haldas. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have the coveted after lunch spot following Metropolitan Callistos. I need to talk to Jack about that. Actually, I guess 3, 4, 5 months ago, I don't remember when, Jack called me and we were kicking around ideas for the conference and who the speakers were, and he had quite a few of the speakers already arranged. Then he asked me if I'd be willing to be a speaker. And I have to admit, I was pretty reluctant at first, because when he told me the list, it's a pretty impressive list. And I was like, who am I to be among that group of people? And the other thing is, clearly, I'm not a priest, and I'm not an academic, and I'm not a scholar. And a lot of the conferences I've been at here, there's been some very well done scholarly work papers that have been published. So I thought, what is it that I would bring? So Bishop John Michael said a little bit about my background, but I'm going to give you a little bit more because it's going to set up the perspective that I'm bringing, because the title of my talk today, my lecture, is called Reflections Inspired by Kietian Crete, an Orthodox layperson's perspective on unity and division. So I'm going to talk a bit about the two conferences, but mainly I'm going to reflect on this notion of unity and division, which is the reason that all of us are here, is because we desire more unity and less division. So, as Bishop John Michael said, I am an author. I did publish a book with Jack, and it was that book, Sacramental Living, which actually originally started off as nothing more than letters to my daughter. My daughter is a very outgoing, extroverted person, and it became clear to me when she was a young girl that she was not going to listen to her introspective and brooding father drone on and on about issues about faith and life. So I wanted to create a record for her of things I just wanted to share with her about what it means to understand and live our Christian faith. And then it just became the idea of a book, and then the book was published, and I had the good fortune to present it to the Pope and the Patriarch, and through that book it led to other things. It led to the opportunities that I'm currently doing now. Bishop John Michael mentioned Ancient Faith Radio. I don't know if those of you, if you're familiar with it. Ancient Faith Radio, or Ancient Faith Ministries, is a radio broadcasting and publishing company that specializes in Orthodox content. And it has a very broad range of content. There's lots of contributors. There's something for everybody out there. And like any good Christian content, it's applicable and germane to any sincere Christian. So I know a lot of Catholic Christians that listen to it, as well as Orthodox, and vice versa with some of the resources that are out there. I also do a lot of work with the Orthodox Christian Network. Again, they've been around 20 plus years, and they started off on the radio, but they've moved into social media and other things, and they have a fairly big reach around the world. I know their Facebook page reaches close to 1 million people globally, and Ancient Faith has a lot of good reach too. If you're not familiar with them, they're similar in thought and practice to EWTN. There's some differences between them, but they're an analogous organ. I mean, obviously there's a difference of what tradition they belong to. There's some differences in their format, but they're analogous. So through that organization, starting in January, I teach an adult religious education class at my church, and I'm going to get back to the importance of adult education. And they asked me if I would live stream the class, and I did, but I had no idea what the reach would be. It reaches on average, I did it January through May, and I'll pick it up again in September, but it reaches, according to social media statistics, 40,000 people. Of that 40,000, 6,000 or 7,000 people watch it for some degree of time. I'm not quite sure what all these statistics mean, but the point being, and we were just talking about it in the meeting before I stood up, the point being is these organizations have a lot of reach and a lot of good content, and there may be some things that here, our organization here wants to leverage in the future as we think about future conferences and ways to get our word out and the things that we're doing and focusing on in terms of unity, church unity, and all of the good things that are going on, not only at the leadership level, but at the parish levels as well. So I bring an orientation to everything I do as a layperson. What does it mean to live our faith on a daily basis, 24/7, 365? What does it mean to live our faith? That's where my focus is all the time, and that's the lens by which I see the reality, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. You know, this topic and what we're doing here today, that's how, when I think about KT and Crete, that's how I process it through. What does it mean to the average layperson? What does it mean to our daily life today? And one thing I'm convinced about, and I just came back from, actually Ancient Faith had a conference before this one, and there was a very dynamic speaker. Some of the Greeks in the room might be familiar with him, Bill Marianos. I see Marilyn nodding her head. He's a terrific speaker. But in his 2-hour presentation to us, he hit on something that I never heard it before, maybe you have, but I thought it was really important. He talked about the difference between being a teacher, a preacher, and a reacher. And he said teachers are informational, preachers are inspirational, but reachers are transformational. And then he did a survey about all of us who were attending the conference, where do we see ourselves? And most of us saw ourselves as teachers, but we want to be reachers. I think when it comes to the message of what is going on between our churches and the Orientali Lumen Foundation and all the work that's being done on church unity, we have to find a way to be reachers to the laity, to make them care about this good work. So that's basically what I'm going to focus on. So again, I'm going to share a little bit about my perception of the conferences, but this is really a reflection-based discussion, not necessarily a content-based. And I'm going to talk about my thoughts and experiences with the two churches, because I do have some direct background. And then what I was hoping is during the Q&A session, I would love to hear some discussion about the thoughts I share. Do you think they're indicative of your experience as a whole? Do you have different experiences? I'd really love to see a dialogue about what we observe, clergy and laity, in the context of KT and Crete, and in the context of efforts about unity. So specifically, very specifically, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a brief overview of the conferences, somewhat similar to what Metropolitan Calista did, but I'll add a little bit. Talk about why we should care about church unity in general, why the average layperson does not seem to care, doesn't seem to really be on their radar for the most part, and that's debatable, but I'd be interested to hear your experience as well. For those of us that do care, what are the obstacles that we encounter? Or what are the things we need to deal with? And finally, I'll conclude with some practical suggestions that I think would be helpful in terms of bringing back to our parishes and also maybe inspiring some caring about these issues. So here's a brief summary. So KT, I think most of you watched Metropolitan Callista's video. Maybe some of you missed it. I don't know if anybody has actually read the statement. I'm assuming most of you have, but just in brief, it's not a long document. It's actually the summary of the statement is organized into 21 21 stanzas or paragraphs, and 1 through 19 are a summation, and then 20 through 21 are the conclusion. So at a high level, 1 through 7, paragraphs 1 through 7 are really just an introduction of definitions and explanations talking about synodality and primacy. In my opinion, it was easy to read. It was very well done. So someone that's really not familiar with those issues could read those paragraphs and understand about synodality and primacy and a little bit of the history of them in our two churches. So paragraphs 8 through 10 were really about the role of the bishop to the local church. 11 through 14 were about the regional communion of churches and the cooperation and shared responsibilities among bishops of the regions. And then 15 through 19 really focused on the church at a universal level, and the church and how the church evolved, or the evolution of the church in the 5 C's in this order: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And then the relationship of the East and the West with, as Metropolitan Calista said, the specific focus on the role of the Bishop of Rome. And I'm going to read what he said again because I think it's worthy of emphasis, because this is the part of the statement that would interest most Orthodox that I know. So at the end of paragraph 19, if you haven't read it, the exact words read, "Appeals to the Bishop of Rome from the East express the communion of the Church, but the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East." Interestingly, when I was up at the Ancient Faith Conference, I always do cheap research wherever I'm at just to see who knows what, and I thought this is a pretty learned group of people up there. I wonder what they know about these. So I brought up Chieti, I brought up the Council of Crete, and of course this group knew about them, but they were kind of dismissive, like, okay, who cares? What does it matter to us? More was kind of the attitude I got. But one person said, "Yeah, I read Chieti," and he's like, "Yeah, I've read it all before." Then he goes, "But paragraph 19 about the Bishop of Rome," because that was really interesting. So, but I don't know how prolific, especially among my Orthodox brethren, how prolific the average layperson, how that is with the average layperson. Do they really know about that? But I think that, obviously, that's of significant interest to the Orthodox faithful. And then 20 through 21 paragraphs conclude with essentially saying that as we heard earlier, we just need to continue to let the dynamics or the history of the first millennium and what took place during the first millennium be our guide in church relations for the future. So in Crete, like His Grace said on the video, just the fact that it happened was very noteworthy. He mentioned there was 8 official documents, 6 of which were needed votes, 5 of which had unanimous votes, but the one on marriage did not. I'm not going to repeat that. I think most of you heard that. It was the diaspora, the issue of autonomy, fasting, marriage, the mission of the church in today's world. Those were all the published papers. Now, as far based on my research and what I saw, maybe there's more that I missed, but there's a lot of documentation. Jack has it in his books. There's a lot to read about what happened at the Council of Crete. So if you're so inclined, it's worth reading. It's interesting. I think it was, I think Metropolitan's perspective, he's so immersed in these discussions that perhaps it wasn't interesting to him, but to a layperson that doesn't spend a lot of time necessarily on these type of issues, I found the reading interesting. So I'd recommend it if you haven't already. So general reflections on both conferences, or what they make me think about. So as I said, I like to experiment a little bit, and because of what I do in the church and the various lay ministries I'm involved in, I do have exposure to people that are serious about the faith. What I'll say, more of the learned laity, if you will. They're serious, they're committed, they come to the classes, they listen to podcasts, they read. I mean, they're really trying to live their faith. So I talked to them because I was curious, and I asked them about Chieti, and I asked them about Crete. Now, granted, most of these were Orthodox because I'm Orthodox, and that's where I am most of the time. So I would say in general, none of them. Well, I'm trying to think, was there that one I just mentioned? But other than that, not a single one even knew what Chieti was. They asked me what it was, and I said, well, it's actually a location, but it's where this conference took place. It's a continuation of dialogue between Orthodox and Catholic bishops and clergy. They didn't know. They really couldn't articulate to me the content of the Council of Crete. They knew it happened. They knew that some of the churches did not participate. They knew there was some dissension. and they knew there were some things discussed, but they really could not tell me what the contents of the council were, and then what some of the outcome of those discussions were. So and furthermore, they didn't seem to have much interest, to be frank. And Jack asked me when we thought about talking. He said, just share what you saw and you learned, and let folks decide how they think about it and what. And we could talk about it in the Q&As, but they just really didn't seem to much interest. But I found that a little disappointing, because as someone like yourself that cares about these conferences, cares about church unity, it's like anything else. When we care about something, we find strength when others care about it, and when they don't care about it, it's a little disappointing. But I understand people have daily busy lives. There's a lot of stuff going on at parish levels, and people aren't always thinking about what's going on at the larger level. But so I started thinking about, okay, Chieti Creed, what they were about. And what struck me more than anything else was the actual composition of the conferences. And so what do I mean by that? Well, one was a joint conference between the two churches, and one was a conference internal to one of the churches. So I want to reflect a little bit on Chieti and reflect on the fact that it was a conference between the two churches, and just have some thoughts, share some thoughts about Orthodox and Catholic relations, because that's what makes me think about. The conferences were about the relations of the two churches. So, I'll give you a little background on myself. I gave you a little bit earlier, but I want to share with you some more, because it'll give you a perspective of where I'm coming from. So, I am cradle Orthodox, in that I was baptized, born into the Orthodox Church, baptized and christened, but I was not a practicing Orthodox Christian growing up. My family had a lot of disruption. My parents were divorced twice. We had bankruptcy. A lot of family tradition went out the window. And with that went regular church attendance. It just wasn't part. Although I received my family was well-intended spiritually, but just didn't go to church as much as we should. But I did get a picture Bible when I was a little boy, and I remember opening it, 4 or 5 years old. I don't remember exactly, but I opened it, and there was a picture of Jesus, and something gripped me. Really struck my heart. I wanted to know more. So I was always a seeker, but I just didn't have the structure. So why is that relevant? Well, as I got older and I was still seeking, I go to church here and there, I was always interested. So then I met a girl, perhaps not the best reason to go to church, but she was pretty and she was Roman Catholic, and at the time or Latin Catholic, that was good enough for me. So I went to the Latin Catholic Church for 4 or 5 years. In college and beyond college, until we broke up. And I didn't just go for her. I went because it was really, for the first time, I was regularly going to church, and I found myself wanting to know more and more. And when I reflect back, and they, as I got to know people, they'd ask me my background. I would say, I was baptized in Christian Greek Orthodox. My family didn't go as much, and they would talk to me about that. Unfortunately, back then in my life, I had nothing really to say, because I just didn't know as much. But I do remember that back then, and then subsequently past that, even to this day, a lot of the dialogue I'll have with Latin Catholics, and I'm making that distinction because we're a group of mainly three traditions: Latin Catholic, Eastern Catholic, and Orthodox of various backgrounds. I remember getting the attitude a lot, like, when we talk about churches, the two churches, it was more or less, we're kind of like estranged brothers or estranged sisters. My Latin Catholic brothers and sisters would often talk about it that way. I was like, we pretty much believe the same thing. I don't know why we're not together. It was very, very casual attitude, if they even cared at all. Whereas what I'm used to in my Orthodox circles and granted, that's where I live day to day, and now I'm much more knowledgeable, and it's kind of comparing apples to oranges, but I definitely get more of an attitude of not so much estranged sisters, but of more of a separation. And there's still a lot of what I encounter among laity is those that know anything. There's a lot of strong objections still to things that the Pope and infallibility. It'll come up, the Immaculate Conception, purgatory, the filioque, and then what I've learned the last 5-6 years being part of this group, and associated with some of you outside of here that are very learned, I would say things like, well, those things aren't what you what I've learned, at least, what I've read, and I said, those things aren't what you think they are, I would say to them. They're not as much of a dividing issue as you think. Our leaders have gotten together, there's been papers published, there's been conferences, there's more to those issues but that still is the prevalent attitude among most of the laity, that these things are sharp divides. I don't really have a comment on, and those of you that are Eastern Christians could comment better than I could. My experience with Eastern Christians has been through this group. So I naturally have I see through the lens of this group, and obviously everybody that's associated with this group is learned and cares. So I'm not sure, in your parishes, what among the average laity, what the thoughts are concerning church unity and getting together, but I know that some of the issues I just brought up is what I encounter a lot in my educational circles and in discussions. So, and some of the attitudes range from sometimes hostile to fairly casual. So I just want to share a few stories with you to kind of illustrate some of my experiences, and you can decide if they're kind of indicative of yours. Bishop John Michael mentioned this pilgrimage we went on, and I think some of you in the room went on it, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. But Jack and Metropolitan Callistus and Father Thomas Loya arranged a pilgrimage to go see the Pope and the Patriarch, October of 2014. And Latin Catholics, Eastern Catholics, Orthodox, we were all represented. So I went, and at the time I had just started teaching my adult class at my parish. So I had taught for a few weeks, and I had to take, I think there was one Sunday I was going to miss because it was a 10-day trip. So I went on the pilgrimage, and I came back on a Friday, I believe, and I prepared my Sunday lesson based on the syllabus I created. I didn't just want to egotistically assume that everybody wanted to hear about this trip. I thought they might, but I wasn't sure, so I wanted to prepare. So I got to the class, and of course everybody wanted to hear about it, and they were very interested in the Vatican, meeting the Pope, the Patriarch. They were very fascinated by it. We ended up spending the whole class on it. So there was a woman in the class, and I'd seen her, I didn't really know her, and she just sat there and observed, didn't say too much. So over the next couple months, I continued to teach weekly. She showed up maybe 2 or 3 times, and every time she showed up, just coincidentally, although I don't really believe anything's a coincidence, something about church relations and the Pope happened to come up in that class. And I would answer the question. And being that I am ecumenical by nature, I do want to see unity. I was been, very impressed, like many people, with a lot of things that Pope Francis did, so I spoke well of him. She really got incensed. And she stood up and yelled at me and tried to incite some of the other people in the class to kind of rally around what she was saying. And she said, you're teaching heresy. This is not right. This is the class about how to become a good Orthodox Christian. And I said, I was teaching in a chapel area, the iconostasis was behind me, and I said, no. I said, I really don't care if you're a good Orthodox Christian. I said, what I care about is that you're Christ-like, which of course, that's what our faith is all about, theosis, the daily sacramental life of the church, that we grow, our path to salvation is to become more and more Christ-like through the sacramental life of the church. So I was kind of playing on words, but the point I was trying to make was that it wasn't about necessarily the tradition, it was about the faith and drawing closer to Christ. So now, to be fair, so she never came again, and she was mad at me, but now to be fair though, she's a very sweet person. And I'm not going to mention her name, but I don't want anybody to walk out of this room thinking this was a hostile individual. She's a very sweet person. She's devoted and dedicated. She just disagreed with what I was doing. We talked later. She apologized for the outburst, and we talked today. She does disagree with some of the things that she thinks I stand for and some of the things she thinks I'm wrong theologically about. But that's that's kind of an extreme example, but it's not too far off some of the thinking among laity that I encounter. Again, that was a bit of a harsher story, but I've had a couple other things. Another story on my iPhone, which I left over there because I went to buzz in my jacket while I'm up here talking. But on my iPhone, I have a picture of me meeting the Pope. Pope, arguably most famous person on the planet. It's an honor. It was a real honor and privilege. And I thought, what am I going to do cooler in my life than to meet the Pope? So I had on my phone, and I was doing something at church coffee hour, and I had my phone, and all of a sudden I sensed someone over my shoulder. It was a parishioner. And he's like, "Oh, I see the Pope is on your phone." So I knew where this was going. This is true what I'm about to say. I said, luckily I was quick on my feet. I said, "Yes." I said, "But Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is on my iPad, and the screen's a lot bigger." That seemed to satisfy him, so I got out of that without any conflict. Another quick story. I know a gentleman who's in charge at a church office of sending out all of the ecclesiastical emails and things about the church and the church programs. And one morning, he emailed me, because one of the things I do every morning is I have what I call a quotes of the day ministry, where I send out 5 quotes. They're all based on theme, and during my morning prayers every morning, I read the daily readings, the daily epistle, the daily gospel, some devotional books, a bunch of different things. It's part of my daily prayer, and then something will hit me. I never know what it's going to be day to day. Something will hit me. I'll come up with a theme, and I'll select quotes, and I'll send them out. It started off with one young person about 5 years ago. She had Lyme's disease, and I came across an inspirational quote, and I sent it to her. One thing led to another, and some very people with a lot of reach got involved. So now they go out to, I've lost track of how many, but it's over 1,000. And I quote Orthodox, I quote Catholic, I quote Protestant. I mean, because of who I am, I filter things through Eastern theology and to the best of my ability through Orthodoxy. But I'm pretty ecumenical in my who I select from. And one morning I happened to pick one from Pope Francis because something struck me about the environment. I was reading about I guess I was reading about something about that correlated to Genesis and man's dominion over nature, and I just got on this theme of nature and creation. And as you know, Pope Francis, Metropolitan John Zazoulis, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, they've contributed quite a bit to that dialogue, the care of the earth. So I sent out a quote about Pope Francis. So this guy, getting back to this guy, he emailed me back, and he's like, "Oh, I'm glad you sent out that quote. I've been told I can't send them out anymore because," he said, people see the Pope and they get, Orthodox people see the Pope and they get upset. And I know for a fact he doesn't feel that way. I know for a fact the priest of his church does not feel that way. They speak very highly, but there's still sometimes a bit of a reaction among laity, Orthodox laity, to some of those things, and that just causes problems. So they just assume, the parish leadership just assume really avoid it, which is a bit of a shame. And I guess, the last reflection or story I'll share based on when I think about Chieti is something Metropolitan Callistos said during a conversation I had. I mentioned earlier that I kind of came back to Orthodoxy, if you will. I've heard different terms. I'm not really a convert. I guess I'm a revert. I'm not sure what the right way to put it is when you're born into something, but you kind of leave and come back. But one of the reasons I came back was because of him. And this is a common story. A lot of people have had this reaction to his work, but I remember I wanted to know more about Orthodoxy at the time. This is 25 years ago. So I met a man at work, a Greek Orthodox man, and he was talking, and I was like, "George, you're so spiritual, you're so learned. What am I missing? No one's really told me about Orthodoxy. What is it that I'm missing?" And he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll talk to you, but you got to read a book first." He goes, "Go to the bookstore, buy a book by a guy named Timothy Ware, and read the book and come back and talk to me." So I bought the book, read it, got to the second half, which is all about the theology, and I was so excited. I was like, "This is me. This is what I think. This is who I am." I never knew this is what the Orthodox Church is all about. Then I told him, I said, "Yeah, and I found this book by a guy named Bishop Callistos Ware. I think they're related." Kind of did the equivalent of patting me on the head. Said, "Run along now." But anyway, so I was taught. So we were on that pilgrimage I mentioned, and we were sailing, or not sailing, I guess. We had a boat. We were going down the Bosphorus River, and everybody was on deck, and I went downstairs, and his Grace was down there by himself. Eventually, Susan would join us and a few other people, but I had about, 10, 15 minutes with him to myself. And I forget, when I'm about to share, I forget if you were there, Susan, to this point, or how it all was. But I remember talking to him, and by this time we were about 9 or 10 days into the trip. And he'd been teaching daily on the bus tours, sharing with us his thoughts. And he loves, for those of you that know him, he really enjoys, he doesn't like small talk, I gathered, but he really enjoys talking about deep matters. He doesn't always talk about it in a deep way that's boring. He's very, as you know, he's very amusing, very witty, very down to earth. But he likes talking about substantive things. So I was down there, I was like, I'm going to take advantage of this. And I said, Your Grace, I've listened to you now 8 or 9, 10 days. I've read a lot of your work. I've listened to your recording. I'm pretty familiar, I think, with what you think. And I said, from what I've gathered, is it fair to say that there's no substantive difference theologically or sacramentally between our two churches? Now, I know that's an arguable point, but I wanted to just articulate what I think I was getting from him. And he said, on the whole, I would agree. And I said, well, then what keeps us apart? And he said, church governance. So again, it gets back, a lot of this gets back to this sensitivity of the Pope and the Bishop of Rome issue. And that's why this Chieti governance, I said, can you all hear me okay?
No, barely. Yeah.
Okay. So do I have to repeat everything I said in the last 20 minutes?
Can you start over from the beginning?
Okay. So I've been up here the whole time, and all the nodding of heads is just to be polite. No one can hear what I was saying?
We heard it. We heard about the girlfriend.
All right, let me get closer to this. Arch my neck. So, what I was saying is that this lingering issue about the Bishop of Rome and the Pope is, when I reflect on Chieti, that just seems to be something I encounter in Orthodox circles that's still prevalent among the laity, despite statements like Chieti, despite a lot of the work that's going on. And I'll get to ways maybe we can help deal with that. So, let me just reflect briefly then on what Crete brought to mind, because that was an internal conference. Bishop, His Grace said from the beginning, these conferences are very different, so I'm not going to talk about them together, I'm going to talk about them separate. So, Crete was a very different dynamic than Chieti. So, at an event, one of our events with a lot of our seniors, it's called the 50 plus group at our church. I'm 52, so I technically qualify, but it's really older than I. But I was there, and one of the gentlemen, a very intellectual, PhD, very smart man, a very learned man, he brought up amongst the group, he wanted to talk about what happened at Crete. He really wanted to get into it. And everybody was like, who cares? I don't want to hear about this. They just weren't interested. And that, again, that is indicative of the attitude that I've encountered for years in my parish and other things I've done. I was on the parish council for years, and every time we talked about ways we have to support the metropolis and support the archdiocese, I would encounter a very parish-centric focus. We knew we were part of a bigger whole, but we didn't act that way necessarily. And I would encounter, just like on this dynamic I just shared with you, encounter an attitude of who cares. So, but here's the thing: why should we care about these conferences? Why is unity important? What is it that we need to do to help people care? So I'm going to get into now, there's just some things that I'm going to share with you, and you can decide for yourself whether they sound effective or not. But what I've tried to focus on in the mediums that I've been given as a podcaster, a teacher, a writer, is I think if we're going to have our laity care about the efforts going on with unity, we have to help them care about unity in general. So, I mentioned earlier that this whole quoting Bill, teacher, preacher, reacher. So, I don't think, for the most part, I don't think we're going to help them care through intellectual appeals. I don't think we're going to help them care preaching. We have to find ways to reach them the way Christ reached people, using everyday examples, meeting them where they are, using Him as our example to find ways to reach people in their hearts about why this is so important. So I'm going to share some things, both what I'll call theological and practical, that I've used in the classes that I've taught and the things that I've done, and just to some degree of success, but there's just things that I try to reach people's hearts through. So here's what I find myself talking about a lot. I find myself quoting John 17. John 13 through 17 are my absolute favorite parts of the Bible. That was Christ, as you know, Christ's final discourse and teachings to his disciples before the crucifixion and the resurrection. And John 17, may we all be one. And I find myself often saying, for those of you that do not believe in unity or seem to be apathetic towards it, how do you reconcile the fact that Christ, our Lord, wants us all to be one? How do you reconcile the notion of division? How do you reconcile being okay with division when he says we all should be one? I talk a lot about reminding people that our faith is really about wholeness. It's a journey to wholeness. It's about becoming a true person, a real human being. We acknowledge in our faith that Christ is really the only true human being that ever walked the planet. The rest of us are on a journey to becoming whole, to becoming a true human being. And I remind them too that we don't understand God individually. We understand God in the sense of community. God is community within himself. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. One God in three persons, and I think I'm quoting Metropolitan Callistos, dwelling in a movement of perpetual love. So God is community within himself. Trinity. Another thing I share, and this seems to make some impact because people don't tend to think about it, at least been my observation, is I point back to the book of Genesis, early Genesis, where God told Adam, it's not good for you to be alone. At that point in the Bible, Eve didn't exist. There's no sin. It's just Adam and God. You would think Adam had everything he needed. But God tells him, it's not good for you to be alone. We're meant for community. We're meant for unity. There's lots of other things I could share. There's lots of other things I'm sure those of you in the room smarter than me could share from a theological perspective. But those are some things I just try to use to reach people to say, look, wholeness, unity, it's really important. Community. We need to care about it. We need to care about it beyond just our local level. Opposite of unity. What's the opposite of unity? Division. St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 11:18 said, for first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. A note in the Orthodox Study Bible points out that we're supposed to be one church, an indivisible, and that division and factions are contrary to the church. I often bring up that the word divide has its derivation from the word, my pronunciation is always hard on things, diabolos, to divide, to evil. So my point is that let's not take division casually. Let's see it for what it is. So much of evil comes from division. Saint Ignatius of Antioch reminds us, flee from divisions as the beginnings of evil. And we have to acknowledge too, we're affected at divisions at all levels. We internal and external. We see it within ourselves, right? We understand that our nature is good, but our will is damaged. So we have discord and division within ourselves between, as Paul says in Romans, what I want to do, I do not do, but what I don't want to do, I do. I mean, we're at war within ourselves often. Within ourselves, we see divisions among ourselves. Just look at the political landscapes of the world today. Major divide in our country. We see it in Britain. It's just division is rampant. We see division among our churches. That's why we're here, because we're not one. We're divided. We see division not only among our churches, but we see them within our churches, within our parishes. There's division. One of the quotes I sent out the other day, as I mentioned my quotes of the day, I sent out this quote because division was on my mind. I guess subconsciously I knew I was coming here to speak, and I was thinking about unity and division. And here's the quote that I sent out. There's too much rhetoric today that's divisive. Politicians of all kinds are constantly tearing each other down in the media. Everyday people use social media to trash each other mercilessly, writing things they would never say to someone's face. Christ unites and the devil divides. Christ said if you're not with him, you are against him. Each one of us needs to pay constant and close attention to our own rhetoric with a high degree of self-awareness so we can see whose side we are truly on. Again, I just think those are I'm not trying to be a downer with the people I talk to, but I just want to get the point across just how important unity is and how important division is in terms of being something that we shouldn't accept. I just came from a conference too where they talked about that when you speak, when you podcast, when you communicate anymore, people are expecting and respond to story more than lecture. Again, it gets back to being transformational than informational. So, I thought about story because at one time I had ambition to write a story because I thought about it. It's no accident the way things happen. I thought about my involvement with this group that started with Jack 5 or 6 years ago, and I realized, I guess division had been on my mind for a long time because I recall the other day, I was looking on my bookshelf and I was flipping through some books and I came across C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. People familiar with that book at all? Yeah. Okay, pretty famous book. But it was a senior devil instructing a junior devil in the art of temptation, and I thought, at one point I had ambition to write my own story. And it was going to go like this. It was going to be right after the crucifixion and the ascension with the devil calling a council meeting with his top demonic advisors because he realized he had been defeated. He realized that what Christ had done. And now he saw he saw Pentecost and the beginnings of the church. And he needed a new strategy. So they sat around the boardroom and what they decided was they clearly couldn't outright defeat God, but they could divide his church. That would be the most damage they could do. So they set out a plan how to divide. First they're going to split it into two and then work on the split in two and how to divide further among. And if they could sow enough division, they would dilute the church. And the end of the story was going to be that God thwarted them because even though it wasn't God's intent to have that division, that God used the variety because God clearly delights in variety as we can see in nature and around us. As we look at our different faces, he used that variety to bring people back together. I never wrote the story, but I thought about, stories may be a powerful way to get a notion across about the evils of division. So, anyway, I'll stop there in terms of some of the theological things I try to share. Let me talk about some practical things. And I don't, I'm using theological and practical to draw a distinction for the sake of this talk. I don't see them as separate things. I see them all as one. Our spirituality is practical in every sense. But I think the things I'm about to share, these are things that I've experienced seem to wake people up or at least create dialogue. We were talking about it a little bit in the Society of St. John Chrysostom meeting. And that's the hard truth, that the Christian church, at least in this country, is declining. And most Christians do care about that, even what I'll call casual, because if nothing else, they worry about their children. Are they going to have the church that they grew up going to? Is it going to be there for their kids? And you can trace this decline directly back to this notion of division that I'm talking about, because we have a problem now of both retention and attraction. And I've spent the last 6-8 months studying this issue quite a bit because of the adult class I teach, and some of the theme of my class this year was modern trials to our ancient faith, the challenge of living, called it orthodoxy, but it's really the challenge of living Christianity in today's America. So there has been a study that came out of Notre Dame beginning in 2002. Many of you may have heard of it, National Study of Youth and Religion. And it's followed youth from early ages up until, I think there's 4 categories, teen, young teen, emerging adult, young adult, I forget, but they followed them through all these stages, up through early teen years, up through their 20s. And 4 books came out of it. And it's been very thorough study, and it's been quoted quite a bit. I've heard Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant leaders quote these studies and the results of these studies to show what's going on in the American church today, which is us. So what's going on? Well, this stat gets bandied about, and it seems to have been adopted as true or close to true, that 6 out of 10 of our young adults are leaving the church and not coming back. I gave a talk to a group of seniors the other day, and I was talking about this. So I was kind of harping on it, actually. And one person stood up and said, "Yeah, don't worry about it. This happens all the time. Young people leave, they have kids, they come back." And I was like, "No, that used to be. But these studies are showing that's not the case." And why is it? It's not because beliefs have fundamentally changed. according to the studies at least, today, the teens of today, the young people today are following the same patterns as their grandparents and parents had in terms of their spiritual and religious practices. And I'll give you a few data points. There is going to be a little bit of a difference, but not significant. Like this study, again, this was a Catholic study, but I've heard Orthodox podcasts and read Orthodox articles that are quoting the study saying this is very germane to the Orthodox Church. So young people going to Mass, it used to be that young people, teens, when I say young people, it's teens and early 20s, 34% would go to Mass regularly. Now, that was back in the 60s and 70s. Now that's down to 20. So that's a bit of a drop. But same group, well, actually, in the 80s, it used to be that same group, 63% of the time would do daily prayer, 63% of the time. Now it's down to 45. Religious affiliation, how their faith informed their daily life. Young people of the 60s, 26%. Today, 26%. So the studies reveal nothing new, that there's always been a bit of a minority that's really embraced the faith and embraced the gospel. So what really has changed? What's been the source of decline? It gets back to this notion of division. What's happened is, what these studies have shown, is that, yes, we're divided as a church, Christian church as a whole, but within our parishes, what's happened is that we've segregated our ministries. We have youth ministry, young adult ministry, senior ministry. Sometimes we don't even worship at the same time or in the same physical place within the church. So what it's created is the most significant relationships among young people and people in general used to be within the church. They're no longer within the church. There used to be multi-generational relationships that were formational to young people's lives. But they'd have aside from their parents, they'd have adult mentors. But now, with all this segregation, they're having an intergenerational dynamic. They're not getting the benefit of the wisdom of those of us that have lived longer, that have gone through things, that have even maybe strayed and come back to the faith. They don't have that. It's very intergenerational. And again, it gets back to these divisions that we've allowed to happen, not only among us, but also internal to us. Also what it's doing is that, therefore, they're not, in other words, the bottom line is they're not anchored in the church. So they leave. Now, I mentioned, it's one of retention and attraction, but we also have an external problem. When you talk to young people, and I teach them, they come to my adult class, because the church is not unified, young people that are seeking, they see a face of the church that they can't pinpoint. Where do I get this? Well, I looked into this. The studies I mentioned earlier quoted some of this detail, but I also read some studies by the Barna Group, which actually is an evangelical organization. But again, a lot of their work is being adopted by other organizations because they see the applicability to their own church culture. So young people can't get a handle on what the church stands for because different churches say different things. And often they're very distrustful of institutions in general. They're distrustful of organized religion to begin with. You hear that from the millennials, and you read that about them. They see church leadership much like they see Congress, right? A bunch of adults that they don't think can get their act together. I'm not saying it's fair. It's certainly not my opinion by any means, but I'm just telling you some of the things that I've not only read, but I've experienced when I talk to them. They corroborate these things that I've read and studied. So the fact that they're not going to church or not coming back to the Christian church, but they're still spiritual. So they're seeking other things. This division is creating a vacuum. And there's been a rise in popularity among Eastern religions and other meditative practices and philosophies that aren't Christian-based. So is that stuff specific to Chieti and Crete? No. But it does emphasize the importance of the work we're doing to have unity amongst ourselves, so then we can present a consistent face, a consistent message, and be unified so that we can appeal or easily show the young people what we're about. And finally, before I get into some things to conclude about what I think we can do, another appeal I make is just one at a family level. Let's talk and say, no one wants to see their family bicker, right? Most normal people don't want to see their family feud. They're upset when their family's not getting along. Christ said in the Bible, asked, who are your mothers and brothers and sisters are outside to get you? When he was in the synagogue, he said, who are my brothers and sisters, the ones that do the will of God? John 17, he wants us all to be one. It's clear that the body of Christ, we're supposed to be one family, and that he demands more of us than just, demands that we embrace him and become one with him, not just caring about our tradition or our parish alone. There's bigger things at stake. So finally, Jack asked me, he said, don't conclude until you talk about things that you think we can do differently. What are some practical suggestions that we could do? Obviously, I don't have all the answers. I do think that it's incredibly important that in each of our parishes, Eastern Catholic, Latin Catholic, Orthodox, that we look at our education and our outreach. We were talking earlier about the decline, and Deacon Evans brought up how Orthodox churches seem to be declining more than most, according to a Pew study. I hadn't read that study, but it's possibly true. Pew's a reputable organization. But I also read that some parishes that are growing, they have some things in common. What is it they have in common? Well, they have a robust adult education program, because the adults are the ones that are with the kids, the young people, Monday through early Sunday. That's where the faith is lived most of the time. It's outside the church walls, right? It's not just Sunday. So adults need to be passionate about the faith and embrace the faith. And to do that, we all need education. We need edification from each other and by each other. That's why I mentioned some of those organizations earlier, because they have tremendous content geared towards adults. But we need, and then I would say, in particular, what comes up a lot in the adult classes that I'm part of, what I hear is the notion of comparative religion. People are always curious about their faith and about their other... Am I drifting away again? Sorry. They're always curious about different churches, different faiths. We just had our annual Greek festival at our church, and I spent all 3 days doing the church tours. And they evolved from just being tours to just being Q&A sessions as people would wander in. I had different types of Orthodox Christians come in. I had a ton of Latin Catholic Christians come in. I had Hindus. I had Buddhists, and every one of them was curious from a comparative perspective about the faith. So what I would say for these adult programs at our parish level, we also need people that can speak learnedly about other faiths, other church traditions, so that people can know it and be informed. I think, obviously this has, I don't do anything apart from working directly with my pros dominos, my priest, because it all has to be done under the authority of the parish and just the general authority of the church. So we're not stepping out of bounds. But I really think we need these educational resources at our parishes so that we can make sure that we can talk to these issues. And I know they were effective, the church tours at least, because my priest shared with me. And it wasn't just me, there was a couple other people, but he got lots of letters and emails just saying how much they enjoyed the church tours, how much they enjoyed the discussions about the other faiths, and learning more about the Orthodox Church in this case. I think, too, that we have to be patient in establishing these type of programs. I know that when I was first working with my priest to start the adult program at my church, I called Father Tony Rain, and I asked him, he's the director of our Archdiocese Religious Education, and I said, what's going on in our parish nationally? Who has great adult programs? And he told me about this one program down in Charlottesville. So I spoke to the man that runs it. And he said, it took me 5 years to get it off the ground, and had I been judged, had it been a job I was being paid for, I would have been fired for lack of results for 4 or 5 years. It takes a while for these things to get going. So we just have to, for those of us, I know my adult class it's changed over the last couple of years, it's grown, it just takes a while to become part of the culture. And I remind myself a lot, hey, in the end, I'm just a facilitator. It's God's work, it's the Spirit's work, we just have to do our part. I think, too, and lastly, I'll conclude with this notion of outreach. Metropolitan Callisto talked about the importance of developing relationships and friendships. These studies I've read about church decline and church division, one of the things, parishes that are growing, at least I'll talk from the perspective of Orthodox parishes because that's what I know, those ones that are growing have adult programs. They also do a lot of community outreach, and They do these community outreach initiatives with other local churches outside of their tradition. So it may be that in the town it's an Orthodox and Catholic church getting together, or maybe it's evangelical church. But the bottom line is that they're interacting in their community with other churches, and they're doing good works unified, and that seems to be making a difference in terms of sustaining the parish and growth. So I'll end by just saying that, like I said, this was a reflection on the importance of unity and division. I've shared with you some of my thoughts and experiences. They're by no means necessarily the final word on any of this. I really would be interested in the Q&As to hear your thoughts on anything I shared, and also your own experiences. Similar, different, whatever you want to share. Thank you very much.